French Revolution. The French Revolution of 1789 was the most startling event in the history of Europe since the fall of Rome. A new phenomenon then appeared before the world. Never before had a mob apparently organized successful revolution against all other classes in the state, under high-sounding but quite nonsensical slogans and with methods bearing not a trace of the principles enshrined in those slogans. Never before had any one section of any nation conquered all other sections, and still less swept away every feature of the national life and tradition, from king, religion, nobles, clergy, constitution, flag, calendar, and place names to coinage. Such a phenomenon merits the closest attention, especially in view of the fact that it has been followed by identical outbreaks in many countries. So start noticing a pattern here, Goyim. These are Jews behind the scenes. When these buildings start falling, or these nations start falling, it's because there are termites behind the scenes under the wall, tearing away at the buttresses holding the house up. They're chewing through all the 2x4s, and it looks like just a mob on the streets, when really that's just a symptom of Jewish behind-the-scenes subversion, tyranny, murder, and intrigue. The main discovery that such an examination will reveal is this fact. The revolution was not the work of Frenchmen to improve France. It was a work of aliens whose object was to destroy everything, which had been France. This conclusion is borne out by the references to foreigners in high places in the revolutionary councils, not only by Sir Walter Scott, but by Robespierre himself. We have the names of several of them, and it is clear that they were not British, or Germans, or Italians, or any other nationals. They were, of course, Jews. Let us see what the Jews themselves have to say about it. Quote, "Remember the French Revolution, to which it was we who gave the name of Great. The secrets of its preparation are well known to us, for it was wholly the work of our hands." And this is a quote from the Protocols of Zion, number 7. Protocol number 7. God. Okay, moving on. Quote, "We were the first to cry among the masses of people the words, liberty, equality, fraternity. The stupid Gentile poll parrots flew down from all sides onto these baits, and with them carried away the well-being of the world. The would-be wise men of the Gentiles were so stupid that they could not see that in nature there is no equality, and there cannot be freedom," meaning, of course, freedom as understood by socialists and communists, freedom to wreck your own country. And that's from Protocol of Zion, number 1. With this knowledge in our possession, we shall find we possess a master key to the intricate happenings of the French Revolution. The somewhat confused picture of characters and events moving across the screen, which our history books have shown us, will suddenly become a concerted and connected human drama. When we begin to draw parallels between France of 1789, Britain of 1640, Russia of 1917, Germany and Hungary of 1918 to 1919, and Spain of 1936, we shall feel the drama grip us with a new and personal sense of reality. Revolution is a blow struck at a paralytic. Even so, however, it must be obvious that immense organization and vast resources, as well as cunning and secrecy far above the ordinary, are necessary for its successful preparation. It is amazing indeed that people should suppose that mobs, or the people, ever have, or ever could undertake such a complicated and costly operation. No mistake, moreover, could be more dangerous, for it will result in total inability to recognize the true significance of events, or the source and focus of a revolutionary movement. The process of organizing revolution is seen to be firstly the infliction of paralysis, and secondly the striking of the blow or blows. It is for the first process, the production of paralysis, that the secrecy is essential. Its outward signs are debt, loss of publicity control, and the existence of alien-influenced secret organizations in the doomed state. Debt, particularly international debt, is the first and overmastering grip. Through it, men in high places are suborned, and alien powers and influences are introduced into the body politic. When the debt grip has been firmly
established, control of every form of publicity and political activity soon follows, together with a full grip on industrialists. The stage for the revolutionary blow is then set. The grip of the right hand of finance established the paralysis, while it is the revolutionary left that holds the dagger and deals the fatal blow. Moral corruption facilitates the whole process. By 1780, financial paralysis was making its appearance in France. The world's big financiers were firmly established. Quote, they possessed so large a share of the world's gold and silver stocks that they had most of Europe in their debt, certainly France. End quote. So writes Mr. McNair Wilson in his Life of Napoleon, and continues on page 38, quote, a change of a fundamental kind had taken place in the economic structure of Europe, whereby the old basis had ceased to be wealth and had become debt. In the old Europe, wealth had been measured in lands, crops, herds, and minerals, but a new standard had now been introduced, namely a form of money, to which the title credit had been given. Credit! The debts of the French kingdom, though substantial, were by no means insurmountable, except in terms of gold, and had the king's advisers decided to issue money on the security of the lands and the real wealth of France, the position could have been fairly easily righted. As it was, the situation was firmly gripped by one financier after another, who either could not or would not break with the system imposed by the international usurers. Under such weakness or villainy, the bonds of usury could only grow heavier and more terrible, for debts were in terms of gold or silver, neither of which France produced. And who were the potentates of the new debt machine, these manipulators of gold and silver, who had succeeded in turning upside down the finances of Europe and replacing real wealth by millions upon millions of usurious loans? The late Lady Queenborough, in her important work Occult Theocracy, gives us certain outstanding names, taking her facts from L'Antisemitisme by the Jew Bernard Lazare in 1894. In London, she gives the name of Benjamin Goldsmeed and his brother Abraham Goldsmeed, Moses Mokada, their partner, and his nephew, Sir Moses Montefiore, as being directly concerned in the financing the French Revolution, along with Daniel Itzig of Berlin and his son-in-law David Friedlander and Herz Surfbier of Alsace. These names recall the Protocols of Zion, and turning up number 20, we read, quote, the gold standard has been the ruin of states which adopted it, for it has not been able to satisfy the demands for money, the more so as we have removed gold from circulation as far as possible, end quote. And again, quote, loans hang like a sword of Damocles over the heads of rulers who come begging with outstretched palm, end quote. No words could describe more aptly what was overtaking France. Sir Walter Scott, in his Life of Napoleon, Volume 1, thus describes the situation, quote, these financiers use the government as bankrupt prodigals are treated by usurious moneylenders, who, feeding their extravagance with the one hand, and with the other wring out their ruined fortunes the most unreasonable recompenses for their advances. By a long succession of these ruinous loans, and the various rights granted to guarantee them, the whole finances of France were brought to total confusion, end quote. King Louis's chief finance minister during these last years of growing confusion was Necker, quote, a Swiss of German extraction, son of a German professor, of whom McNair Wilson writes, quote, Necker had forced his way into the king's treasury as a representative of the debt system owning allegiance to that system, end quote. We can easily imagine what policy the allegiance inspired in Necker, and when we add to this the fact that his previous record was that of a daring and unscrupulous speculator, we can understand why the national finances of France, under his baneful aegis, rapidly worsened, so that after 4 years of his manipulations, the uncomfortable king's government had contracted an additional and far more serious debt of £170 million. By 1730, Freemasonry had been introduced into France from England. By 1771, the movement had attained such proportions that Philip Duc de Chartres, afterwards d'Orleans, became Grand Master. This type of Freemasonry was largely innocent both in policy and personnel in its early days, but as events proved, the real moving spirits were ruthless and unscrupulous men of blood. The Duc d'Orleans was not one of these latter. Though a man of little principle and an extravagant, vain, and ambitious libertine, a libertine, by the way, is someone that says, do it in the road. It's like a 1960s rock star. Like, shoot heroin, do whatever feels good, gay, bisexual orgies, whatever. That's what a libertine is. Vain and ambitious libertine, he had no motives beyond the ousting of the king and the establishing of a democratic monarchy with himself as the monarch. Having, in addition, but little intelligence, he made the ideal stalking house for the first and most moderate stage of revolution, and a willing tool of men whom he probably scarcely knew, and who sent him to the guillotine soon after his base role had been played. So this is an example of a corrupt, morally corrupt individual who the Jews saw as a useful idiot, who did his part. This is the equivalent of taking trips to Epstein Island to have fun with the child forced sex workers, and then they just chopped his head off once he had served his purpose. And this is a message to any of you out there that may be a CEO somewhere or someone that's cucking to the Jews. They don't give a shit. As soon as you've served your purpose, they're going to kill you, just like the rest of us that actually stood on principles and tried to stop their tyranny. The Marquis de Mirabeau, who succeeded him as the leading figure of the revolution, was cast in much the same role. He was a much abler man than d'Orleans, but so foul a libertine that he was stunned by all his own class, and imprisoned more than once at the instance of his own father. He is known to have been financed by Moses Mendelssohn, the head of the Jewish Illuminati, and to have been more in the company of the Jewess Ms. Hertz than was her husband. He was not only an early figurehead in French Freemasonry in the respectable years, but introduced Illuminism into France. This Illuminism was a secret revolutionary society behind Freemasonry. The Illuminati penetrated into all the lodges of Grand Orient Freemasonry and were backed and organized by Kabbalistic Jews. It is interesting to note that the Duc d'Orléans and Talleyrand were both initiated into Illuminism by Mirabeau short after the latter had introduced it into France from Frankfurt, where its headquarters had been established in 1782 under Adam Weishaupt. And mind you, Adam Weishaupt was the Jew that had been living in Bavaria that had originally come up with this whole revolution in France thing, and the Illuminati is a tool to achieve it. And you see a lot of books and stuff about the Illuminati and stuff nowadays that are designed to throw you off the trail of what the Illuminati really was, which was a secret Jewish steering committee for revolutionary organizations. And you notice that he went from Bavaria, this Weishaupt Jew, to Frankfurt, which was the seat of power of early Rothschild banking. That was where even Nathan the Rothschild, the one who in 1812, completely took control of the banking system in England, and thus completely enslaved through the cornering of all of the bond markets. Anyhow, all of these Rothschilds originally spread out like mold from Frankfurt, where they first came up with the idea of enslaving entire nations with national debts. So remember that. This Illuminati stuff may not be important nowadays, but back then, the Illuminati was very real, and it murdered hundreds of thousands of people indirectly and directly, trying to spread Jewish revolutionary control of all of the different countries of Europe. In 1785, there happened a strange event which makes it seem as though the heavenly powers themselves made a last-moment attempt to warn France and Europe against these massing powers of evil. Lightning struck dead a messenger of the Illuminati at Ratisbon. The police found on the body papers dealing with plans for world revolution. Thereupon, the Bavarian government had the headquarters of the Illuminati searched, and much further evidence was discovered. French authorities were informed, but the process of paralysis was too far advanced, and no action resulted. By 1789, there were more than 2,000 lodges in France affiliated to the Grand Orient Freemasonry, the direct tool of international revolution, and their adepts numbered over 100,000. Thus, we get Jewish Illuminism under Moses Mendelssohn and Masonic Illuminism under Weishaupt established as the inner controls of a strong secret organization covering the whole of France. Under the Illuminati worked Grand Orient Freemasonry, and under that, again, the Blue, or National, Masonry had operated until it was converted overnight into Grand Orient Masonry by Philippe d'Orléans in 1773. Little did Égalité suspect the satanic powers that he was invoking when he took that action, and satanic they certainly were. The name Lucifer means light bearer, and Illuminati those who were lit by the light. By the time the Estates General met at Versailles on 5th May 1789, the paralysis of the executive authority by the secret organizations was complete. Paralysis by control of public opinion and publicity was well advanced by then also. This was the matter of its accomplishment. By 1780, d'Orléans' entire income of 800,000 livres, thanks to his reckless gambling and extravagance, was mortgaged to the moneylenders. In 1781, in return for accommodation, he signed papers handing over his palace, estates, and house, the Palais Royal, to his creditors, with powers to form there a center of politics, printing, pamphleting, gambling, lectures, brothels, wine shops, theaters, art galleries, athletics, and other uses, which subsequently took the form of every variety of public debauchery. In fact, Égalit's financial masters used his name and property to install a colossal organism for publicity and corruption, which appealed to every lowest instinct in human nature, and deluged the enormous crowds so gathered with the filthy, defamatory, and revolutionary output of its printing presses and debating clubs. As Scudder writes in A Prince of the Blood, quote, "It gave the police more to do than all the other parts of the city." End quote. It is interesting to note that the general manager installed by the creditors at the Palais Royal was one de Laclos, a political adventurer of alien origin, in other words, a Jew, author of Les Hommes Dangereux and other pornographic works, who was said, quote, to study the politics of love because of his love for politics, end quote. So in other words, the Jews, just like the sexual revolution here in the United States that at the same time was going with the Frankfurt School Revolution, the 1960s, hey, come join the hippie commune, hey, come be a hippie, hey, come do it on the road, hey, stick it to the man, hate your parents, and you can have an orgy with me and this chick that's on LSD. And that, the Jews always used debauchery and loose women and prostitution and child rape and gambling and all the other vices to attract people to their movement, the same way as they use these vices to ensnare people that will be beachheads in an elite to introduce revolution. And then the same filth is offered as recompense to anyone who joins in the revolution. They get to partake in the debauchery. It's just like that scene from the 300 where the Gollum figure, he gets to go take place in orgies with the harem of Cyrus if he just does whatever the hell the enemy wants. The alien elites coming in, why not enjoy all of the harems and stuff? As the Gollum character said, I want it all. This steady stream of corruption and destructive propaganda was linked with a series of systematic personal attacks of the vilest and most unscrupulous nature upon any public characters whom the Jacobins
thought likely to stand in their way. Oh, earlier in the book I said Jacobites. I meant to say Jacobins. These are the equivalent. Remember the Levelers in the 1640s in England that brought in the Jews? Jacobins. That's the term for them here. And the later Jacobins and libertines. Jacobins are more politically active. Libertines are just kind of like the hippies doing it in the road. Moving on. The process was known as l'infamie, and that is a process of character assassination or ad hominem attacks against anyone who stood up against the Jewish debauchery and intrigue. Marie Antoinette herself was one of the chief targets for this typically Jewish form of attack. No lie or abuse was too vile to level at her. More intelligent, alert, and vigorous than the weak and indolent Louis, Marie Antoinette presented a considerable obstacle to the revolution. All it takes is a few strong men to stop these Jews. I'm telling you, Goyim, stand up. She had, moreover, received many warnings regarding Freemasonry from her sister in Austria, and no doubt was by this time more awake to its significance than when she had written to her sister some years previously. Quote, I believe that as far as France is concerned, you worry too much about Freemasonry. And this is her writing to her sister in Austria, Marie Antoinette. Here, it is far from having the significance that it may have elsewhere in Europe. Here everything is open and one knows all. Then where could the danger be? One might well be worried if it were a question of a political secret society. But on the contrary, the government lets it spread, and it is only that which it seems an association, the objects of which are union and charity. One dines, one sings, one talks, which has given the kings occasion to say that people who drink and sing are not the suspect of organizing plots, nor is it a society of atheists, for we are told God is on the lips of all. They are very charitable. They bring up the children of their poor and dead members. They endow their daughters. What harm is there in all that? End quote. What harm indeed if these blameless pretensions masked no darker designs? Doubtless the agents of Weishaupt and Mendelssohn, remember Weishaupt's the masonry for Goyim, and Mendelssohn is the masonry for Jews, so secret societies that interfaces with the Goyim. The Shabbos Goyim is under Weishaupt, and Mendelssohn is like the B'nai Brit, the ADL, like the Jewish power structure that really controls what Weishaupt's troops do, the Shabbos Goyim. Most of which don't even know they're working for Jews. Only the very top Goyish Masons knew that they were working for Jews in these Weishaupt infiltrated lodges that were set up originally just for charity and stuff, as a pretense. Anyhow, doubtless the agents of Weishaupt and Mendelssohn reported on to them the contents of the Queen's letter, and we can imagine them shaking with laughter and rubbing their hands in satisfaction. Oh, you gotta... Here you go, Ramsey put in a merchant hand rub for you. Rubbing their hands in satisfaction. Hands that were itching to destroy the very life of France and her queen, and which at the appropriate hour would give the signal that would convert secret conspiracy into the, quote, massacres of September, end quote, and the bloodbaths of the guillotine. In order to further the campaign of calumny against the Queen, an elaborate hoax was arranged at the time when the financiers and grain speculators were deliberately creating conditions of poverty and hunger in Paris. Remember, before they take down an enemy elite, or someone they see as an enemy elite, or an indigenous elite that won't submit to absolute Jewish tyranny, they first do the bottom-up revolution, and in order to have the bottom-up revolution, you need to starve the people. This is what they're trying to do in Iran, Venezuela, etc., etc. They try and strangle you economically, and they mess with you with speculation. They mess with the gold supply back then, or here they mess with the bond markets or the currency, like George Soros collapsed the British pound sterling in the 1990s. This is how Jews do. You'd better learn well what I'm teaching you here in this book. Nothing changes with these people. Grain speculators were deliberately creating conditions of poverty and hunger in Paris. A diamond necklace valued at nearly $250,000 was ordered at the court jewelers in the Queen's name by an agent of the Jacobins. The unfortunate queen knew nothing of this affair until the necklace was brought round to her for acceptance, when she naturally disclaimed anything to do with the matter, pointing out that she would consider it wrong to order such a thing when France was in so bad a financial way. The printing presses of the Palace Royal, you got to remember that's the Shabbos Goyim agent's palace that he lost from gambling, so the Jews were then using his gentleman's house, or his aristocratic house, as a propaganda production center. The printing presses of the Palais Royal, however, turned full blast onto the subject, and every kind of criticism leveled at the Queen. A further scandal was then engineered for the presses. So basically, the Queen, who they were trying to defame, did not order this expensive £1 million necklace of diamonds when the people of France were starving. But the Jews made it look like she ordered one, and then tried to deliver her one to incite the peasantry, get that bottom-up revolution, just like they tried to do against the Tsar when they were starving and screwing up intentionally the supply lines of the Russians during World War I to get the army and the peasants to rise up against the Tsar, who was trying to limit Jewish power and tyranny. So, moving on. Some prostitute from the Palace Royal was engaged to disguise herself as the Queen. So the Jews hired a whore to impersonate the Queen. And by the forged letter, the Cardinal Prince de Rohan was induced to meet the supposed Queen about midnight at the Palace Royal, supposing he was being asked for advice and help by a queen on the subject of the necklace. The event, needless to say, was immediately reported to the printing presses and pamphleteers, who started a further campaign containing the foulest innuendos that could be imagined concerning the whole affair. The moving spirit behind the scene was Cagliostro, alias Joseph Balsamo, a Jew from Palermo, a doctor of the Kabbalistic art, and a member of the Illuminati, into which he was initiated at Frankfurt by Weishaupt in 1774. When the necklace had finally served its purpose, it was sent over to London, where most of the stones were retained by the Jew Eliason. Attacks of a similar nature were directed against many other decent people who resisted the influence of the Jacobin clubs. Once again, the Jacobin clubs in the 1770s through 1790s were essentially the same thing as like Woodstock or these hippie orgies at these hippie communes, or just drugs, sex, and rock and roll of the 1790s, so to say. Do it in the mud, Goyim. Attacks of a similar nature were directed against many other decent people who resisted the influence of the Jacobin clubs. After 8 years of this work, the process of paralysis by mastery of publicity was complete. God, this makes me wonder if Trump is being paralyzed or if he really was a Shabbos goalie the whole time. It's food for thought. In every respect, therefore, by 1789, when the financiers forced the king to summon the Estates General, the first portion of their plans for revolution, that is, paralysis, were accomplished. So 1789, they've already pretty much got the state wobbling on its knees, about to fall over. And now comes the time, as Ramsey puts, for the knockout blow. It has now only remained to strike the blow or series of blows which were to rob France of her throne, her church, her constitution, her nobles, her clergy, her gentry, her bourgeoisie, her traditions, and her culture, leaving in their place, when the guillotine's work was done, citizen hewers of wood and drawers of water under an alien financial dictatorship. Boom! This is a Jew revolution. Nothing ever changes. From 1789 onwards, a succession of revolutionary acts were set in motion, each more violent than the one preceding it, each unmasking fresh demands and more violent and revolutionary leaders. In their turn, each of these leaders, a puppet only of the real powers behind the revolution, is set aside, and his head rolls into the basket to join those of his victims of yesterday. So don't be a useful idiot for the Jews if they're offering you sex, or if they've got you doing something immoral to a kid, or if they drugged you and you wake up next to a kid or something. Just come public with it. Tell people.
There's no use through duress or through bribery serving the Jews, because if you're not a Jew, they're not going to share power with you. And if they gave you power as an intermediary during the revolution or the overthrow of the people they're trying to conquer, they're going to wind up chopping your head off too. Philip Égalité, Duc d'Orléans, was used. Okay, so this Philip Égalité is also known as a Duc d'Orléans. He was used to prepare the ground for the revolution, to protect with his name and influence the infancy of the Revolutionary Club, to popularize Freemasonry and the Palais Royal, and to sponsor such acts as the March of the Women to Versailles. The women on this occasion were mostly men in disguise. D'Orléans was under the impression that the king and queen would be assassinated by this mob, and himself proclaimed a democratic king. The real planners of the march, however, had other schemes in view. So this D'Orléans guy he was one of the chief useful idiots. He led a crowd to the palace thinking that this crowd of useful idiots would then crown him king. But the Jews don't share power, as you're about to learn. The real planners of the march, however, had other schemes in view. One main objective was to secure the removal of the royal family to Paris, where they would be clear of protection from the army under the power of the Commune or Paris County Council, in which the Jacobins were supreme. So basically, they scared the royal family into running into a trap in Paris, where they had their communists, their Jacobins, their levelers, whatever you want to call them this time, waiting there, waiting to greet them with anything but friendship. They continued to make use of Égalité, or the Duc d'Orléans, right up till the time of the vote on the king's life, when he crowned his sordid career by leading the open vote in voting for the death of his cousin the king. His masters thereafter had no further use for his services, and he very shortly followed his cousin to the guillotine amidst the execrations of all classes. Mirabeau played a similar role to that of Égalité, or the Duc d'Orléans. He had intended that the revolution should cease with the setting up of Louis as a democratic monarch with himself as chief advisor. He had no desire to see violence done to the king. On the contrary, in the last days before he died mysteriously by poison, he exerted all his efforts to get the king removed from Paris and placed in charge of loyal generals still commanding his army. He was the last of the moderates and monarchists to dominate the Jacobin Club of Paris, the bloodthirsty focus of revolution which had materialized out of the secret clubs of the Orient Masons and Illuminati. It was Mirabeau's voice, loud and resonant, that kept in check the growing rage of the murderous fanatics who swarmed therein. There is no doubt that he perceived at last the true nature and strength of the beast, which he had worked so long and so industriously to unchain. In his last attempt to save the royal family by getting them out of Paris, he actually succeeded in shouting down all opposition in the Jacobin Club. That evening he died by a sudden and violent illness, and the author of the Diamond Necklace writes, quote, Louis was not ignorant that Mirabeau had been poisoned, end quote. So the king knew that the guy that was trying to save him, that was kind of realizing he had made a mistake and realized that the king needed to be kept in order to keep these Jews from coming to power. The king realized that this guy, who had been a turncoat and kind of an agent of intrigue, trying then to, I guess, do the moderately right thing towards the end, he was poisoned. Thus, like Philip Égalité, that's the Duc d'Orléans, whose palace the Jews turned into a propaganda center, and later Danton and Robespierre, Mirabeau too was removed from the stage when his role had been played. We are reminded of the passage in number 15 of the Protocols of Zion, and before I read that, the protocol number 15, I want you to remember, if you work with Jews, they're going to kill you. If you're not a Jew, they're not going to share power with you. Your power, your prestige, your status, your access to the Jew-provided whores and all that, that's transient. They're just going to use you, and then they'll kill you. They're going to kill you. They're not going to let you share in their power or the spoils. So moving on. We are reminded of the passage in number 15 of the Protocols of Zion. Quote, "We execute Masons in such wise that none save the Brotherhood can ever have a suspicion of it." End quote. And again, quote, "In this way we shall proceed with those Goy Masons who know too much." End quote. As Mr. E. Scudder writes in his life of Mirabeau, so this is the guy that was a useful idiot, one of the chief ones, just like the Duc d'Orléans, wound up dead after the Jews had used him all up. Quote, "He died at a moment when the revolution might still have been checked." End quote. The figure of Lafayette occupies the stage on several important occasions during these first revolutionary stages. The figure of Lafayette occupies the stage on several important occasions during the first revolutionary stages. He was one of those simple Freemasons who are born they know not whither, in a ship they have not fully explored, and by currents concerning which they are totally ignorant. In other words, most of the useful idiots don't know who they're working for or who's really steering action. And this includes Lafayette. While a popular figure with the revolutionary crowds, he very severely handled several incipient outbreaks of revolutionary violence, notably in the March of the Women to Versailles, during the attack on Tuileries, and at the Champ de Mars. He too desired the establishment of a democratic monarchy, and would countenance no threat to the king, even from Philippe Egalitaire, that's the Duc d'Orléans, whom he treated with the utmost hostility during and after the March of the Women to Versailles, believing on that occasion that the Duc d'Orléans intended the assassination of the king and the usurpation of the crown. Which is true, the Duc d'Orléans thought he was going to be crowned the democratic monarch. Moving on. He evidently became an obstacle to the powers behind the revolution, and was packed off to a war against Austria, which the Assembly forced Louis to declare. Once he did dash back to Paris in an effort to save the king, but he was packed off again to the war. Mirabeau's death followed, and Louis's fate was sealed. The wild figures of Danton, Marat, Robespierre, and the fanatics of the Jacobin Club now dominated the scene. In September of 1792 were perpetuated the terrible, quote, September massacres, 8,000 persons being murdered in the prisons of Paris alone, and many more over the country. So every time there's a Jewish revolution, a bunch of people get whacked. These are intelligent people that can put two and two together, figure out that Jews are behind it. The intelligentsia gets killed. Jewish revolutions are like a rototiller. Anything that's at the top of the field, anything that could grow to be a threat to them is rototilled and just churned up in the maelstrom. This is how Jewish revolutions work, and they're trying to do it to America, just like they're trying to do it to the rest of Europe right now. Anyhow, it should be noted that these victims, referring to the 8,000 in Paris and the other people that were executed in the prisons around the country, it should be noted here that these victims were arrested and held till the time of the massacre in the prisons by one Manuel, procurer of the commune, in other words, a Jew. Sir Walter Scott evidently understood much concerning the influences which were at work behind the scenes. In his Life of Napoleon, Volume 2, so this is Sir Walter Scott, I need to read this eventually, he writes, on page 30, the demand of the Communauté de Paris, which is like the Paris Commune, now the Sanhedrin of the Jacobins, oh, he calls it a Sanhedrin, which is a Jewish court, smart, was, of course, for blood, end quote. And we're going to read that. The footnote here is the Paris County Council equivalent to the LCC in London. I don't know what LCC stands for. Again, on page 56, he writes, quote, the power of the Jacobins was irresistible in Paris, where Robespierre, Danton, and Marat shared the high place in the synagogue, end quote. Alright, so the Jews are starting to kill everyone, even the useful idiots. from before, getting their heads on the chopping blocks, getting ready to guillotine them, and the Jews are taking power for themselves. The useful idiots are all being lined up and killed. Writing of the Commune, Sir Walter Scott states in the same work, quote, "The principal leaders of the Commune seem to have been foreigners, in other words, Jews. Some of the names of these foreigners are worthy of note. There was Soldero de Laclos, manager of the Palais Royal, so basically the Jew in charge of the whorehouse slash propaganda printing press house that was taken from the idiot Shabbos Goy who got too indebted to his Jewish masters, the Duc d'Orléans, who thought he was going to be the new democratic monarch before the Jews just said, nope, you're dead too. So this Cholodro de Laclos, manager of the Palais Royal, was a Jew of Spanish origin. There was Manuel, the procurer of the Commune, already mentioned, who was also a Jew. He was it who started the attack upon royalty at the convention, which culminated with the execution of King Louis, and Marie Antoinette. There was David, the painter, a leading member of the Committee of Public Security, which, quote-unquote, tried the victims. His voice was always raised, calling for death. Yeah, this guy sounds like a Jew for sure. David. Sir Walter Scott writes that this fiend used to preface his, quote, bloody work of the day with the professional phrase, quote, "Let us grind enough of the red," end quote. David, it was who inaugurated the cult of the Supreme Being and organized, quote, the conducting of this heathen mummery, which was substituted for every external sign of rational devotion, end quote. And that is footnoted at 6. Footnote number 6 says Sir Walter Scott, Life of Napoleon, Volume 2. That's a citation. There were Roybal and Gore, 2 of the 5 directors, who, with a council of elders, became the government after the fall of Robespierre, also known as the Directory. So this is the Jew Comintern. This is the Jew commissars. Basically, the mask coming off. The Jews are killing the useful idiots and just taking power for themselves with all sorts of useful front goyish names, but they're really friggin' Jews. Moving on. The terms directors and elders are, of course, characteristically Jewish. One other observation should be made here. It is that this important work by Sir Walter Scott in 9 volumes revealing so much of the real truth is practically unknown, is never reprinted with his other works, and is almost unattainable. This is just like Stolzenitchen. You can get Gulag Archipelago everywhere to talk about how bad leftists and communists are, but you're not going to get his book anywhere until recently, with God bless the internet, by the way, 200 years together, where it says all of these bad people were Jews in the Bolshevik Revolution, just as Sir Walter Scott's works were celebrated while they hid the volumes that showed that all of the people behind the goddamn reign of terror in France were Jews. Moving on. Those familiar with Jewish technique will appreciate the full significance of this fact, and added importance it lends to Sir Walter Scott's evidence regarding the powers behind the French Revolution. To return to the scene in Paris, Robespierre now remains alone and apparently master of the scenes, but this again was only appearance. Let us turn to the life of Robespierre by one G. Renier, who writes as though Jewish secrets were at his disposal. He writes, quote, "From April to July 1794, the fall of Robespierre, the terror was at its height. It was never the dictatorship of a single man, least of all Robespierre. Some 20 men, the committees of public safety and general security, shared the power. Just like the Department of Homeland Security, run by a dual citizen kike under Bush Jr. On the 28th of July, 1794, to quote Renier again, quote, Robespierre made a long speech before the convention, a philippic against ultra-terrorists, uttering vague general accusations. So this guy was a useful idiot, and he was trying to then quell the crowd that was being just turned into a frenzy, and he realized things were going to get out of control, and maybe he sensed the danger to himself. And he says, I dare not name them at this moment and in this place. I cannot bring myself entirely to tear asunder the veil that covers this profound mystery of iniquity.
but I can affirm most positively that among the authors of this plot are the agents of that system of corruption and extravagance, the most powerful of all the means invented by foreigners, in other words, Jews, for the undoing of the Republic. I mean, the impure apostles of atheism and the immorality that is at its base. And of course, and that's an end quote. And of course, Jews ultimately are racialists. They do not. Most of them are atheists. The religion is just to keep the people in line that don't buy into the racial supremacy. Moving on, Mr. Rainier continued with all a Jew's satisfaction, quote, "Had he not spoken these words, he might still have triumphed." End quote. In other words, he named the Jew, now he's got to die. In the same smug sentence, Mr. Rainier unwittingly dots the I's and crosses the T, which Robespierre had left uncompleted. Robespierre's allusion to the corrupting and secret foreigners, quote unquote, was getting altogether too near the mark. A little more and the full truth would be out. At 2 a.m. that night, Robespierre was shot in the jaw and early on the following day dragged to the guillotine. So in other words, the Jews make sure he couldn't talk right before they killed him, because he was about to name the Jew, for whom he had been a useful idiot. Never work with Jews. Moving on, again let us recall Protocol 15, quote, "In this way we shall proceed with Goy Masons who know too much," end quote. Yeah, because the Goys usually will have that non-psychopathic personality that says, hold on, what have I gotten myself involved in? Maybe I should tell the other Goyim what's coming. Oh no, and then the Jews kill them. That was the end of chapter 2.